right, welcome back in, everybody, to another edition of the Mo Vaughn podcast, powered by Perfect Game and the Vaughn Sports Academy. And Mo, very excited to talk to our next guest, one of the best minds in baseball. Been covering baseball for a very long time. Buster Olney from ESPN, ESPN.com, and the Baseball Tonight podcast. We're thrilled to have you, Buster. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Buster,
thanks for having me. Excited to talk to you guys.
You couldn't have a better guy. I mean, this guy is the inside man, got the inside track on all things happening in baseball. I got to ask you a question, though, before we get to that. You went to Northfield, Mount Herman?
I did.
And, so prep school. So I'm a prep school guy. I went to Trinity Pauling Prep School. So I saw that. I was like, man, I got to ask him about that. That's great. I think that whole experience for me was tremendous. So I said, let me ask him about this.
You know who another prep school guy is, Mo? Just before I got on to jump to talk to you guys, someone who you know well, and that would be our friend, Mr. Peter Gammons. And I said, I'm going to be talking to Mo here. I'm going to be talking to Mo in a couple minutes. What do you got on him? And you're one of his favorites, right? And he was talking about your folks, and he said more people need to know about how, he said, Mo's had a life in service of other people, and his family has had a life in service of other people. And he talked about how your folks were close with the folks in the Jackie Robinson's family and
Correct.
would go, and he ran through that. And that was the first thing he mentioned. He didn't say, great hitter, great teammate, on a team. He talked about your family service. I thought that was pretty cool. But Peter went to Groton, as you well know. Right. You mentioned North Mount Herman. For me, look, I grew up on a dairy farm in Vermont, and I always felt this going away to school. I was surrounded. I had great friends in the hometown I grew up in, Randolph Center, but I was surrounded at North Mount Herman by a bunch of people who wanted to do things and go places. And it was the greatest peer pressure you could imagine. And I always thought that was incredibly important for me after coming up from a town of 400 people.
I think you're absolutely right. Trinity Pauling was all boys. So there was really no distractions. And just that every day, my dad was like, hey, you got to get out, man. You're really not focusing and concentrating in high school. You got to go over here. But every day in that environment, I thought, we went, we went to chapel every 6 days a week. There were just certain things, sit down dinner. There's certain things I think helped develop me, and I'm sure it helped develop you also. Oh,
without a doubt. And just raising a standard for me. They went to school with Bill Cosby's kids and right. People from very well-to-do families. Some people, and North Mount Herman is has a pretty diverse student body. And so I got to meet people from all over the world. For someone who grew up in such an isolated place. I mean, on Crocker Road, where our dairy farm is, it's 1.5 miles north, nothing but maple trees, and it's 1 mile south, nothing but maple trees. Right. And so to go from that to at that time was the biggest boarding school, I think, in the country at 1,100 kids. It was awesome for me to have that.
Buster, you've been in the game 37 years, man. And going strong, all that information. I also know, that what got you on your journalistic track was the Dodgers and Sandy Koufax. Speak a little bit about how you started narrowing and migrating to the whole baseball scene, through the Dodgers and Koufax.
So, and it's so funny because during the World Series, I was working for ESPN Radio, and my job was to run on the field at the end of games and do the post-game interviews. So we're there in that incredible Game 3, which would go 18 innings, and sitting 15 feet to my right is Sandy Koufax, right? And sitting 10 feet to my right is Magic Johnson. I was a huge Lakers fan as well. But Sandy Koufax, I read a book about him when I was 8 years old. And that got me in love with baseball. And, my first Little League team growing up in Vermont was in Woodstock, Vermont. We were the Dodgers. And so I was cemented at that point as a huge Dodger fan, to the point that When they lost the World Series in 77 and 78 to the Yankees, and Reggie Jackson stuck his hip out in the way of the ball in the 78 World Series, I was on Bitter Boulevard. And the first time when I was covering the Yankees, I will tell you, I'm talking to Reggie Jackson, and there's this little guy on my shoulder going, I can't believe how much I used to hate you. and like as a fan growing up, and I love talking to Reggie, but absolutely had a full passion for baseball. The rest of my family knows nothing about sports, and they have no interest in sports. When I came back from my first Little League game, my mom was at the kitchen sink and she's working, and I started to recount everything like a 10-year-old sports writer, what happened in our game. And she looked at me and she hated it when I told the story. She looked at me, she said, Buster, you have tremendous potential to be very boring.
Well, it's crazy. I wasn't pulling for the Dodgers this series because I was really going for the lineage with the Guerrero family. But I love what the Dodgers organization does. They have guys, they have ownership. And I've always said this, and we talk about this all the time, Brendan. When you can't win unless your ownership is down to win and pay the price. And you could get mad at whatever you want to do about what the Dodgers are doing. And now, they call them, whatever they used to call the Yankees, the
evil empire.
The evil empire. You call them what you want. But that organization sets out to win, and they get the players to do it, and they're always in it. And I love it regardless.
100%. I covered those Yankee teams in 1998 to 2001, George Steinbrenner, and you'd hear all that criticism all the time. The Yankees just outspend everybody. Well, Mo, you know better than anybody. It's a lot more than that. The Dodgers, they plow so much money into that team. And yes, they sign Yamamoto, $325 million. They signed Tyler Glasnow, $136 million. Blake Snell, Roki Sasaki. But they also have made that place a destination. During the postseason, they actually had one plane for the players, and then they had two planes for family and staff. I mean, think about that. And these are private planes, and they're loading up families, and they're trying to do everything they can to help the players with their families. Freddie Freeman, when his son was going through an issue last year, the Dodgers stepped up for that. Way that and the news has now come out about Alex Vesia's young baby passing away, the response that he got from other people in that organization, I think, will be incredibly meaningful to his family. It is a great organization in how they treat people and how they support people. And just from the baseball side, there's no better example this year than Mookie Betts, right? He wants to be a shortstop. He's a high-end athlete. And so he devotes himself to that position. And I can tell you, and Mookie said it, I probably was the only one in the world who thought I could pull this off. And yet the Dodgers are like, you know what? You're a great player. We're going to share your vision. We're going to work with you. And as the season goes along, we'll make our choices. And it turns out he's one of the best defensive shortstops in baseball. That does not happen in this era without the great organizational support.
I tend to say all the time, that shortstop position is the most grueling position mentally in the game. You just got to be on point 162 straight days playing the game. Do you think that might have had a little toll on him mentally in terms of how he hit throughout the year? I think that it had to. I know, listen, I see mechanics. I see certain things. They say, well, he's a little older, whatever. I just think that position, especially when you're going off there for the first or second full season, takes a lot of mental toll on you to be consistent and playing at that level and playing for championships. I think he's going to have a good year next year all the way around.
I think he's going to have a great year. And you can speak to this. I didn't make it past JV baseball at North Mount Herman. I'll be right honest with you right now. What I heard from different evaluators around the sport is that his hands were kind of messed up. Like the way that he was using his hands, because he's at his best when he can get his swing out front and pull the ball. And so he was struggling to do that. But I completely agree with you about next year. The thing about Mookie is he is a perfectionist. right?
Correct.
He puts a ton of pressure on himself. And he knew if he was going to make that move to shortstop that he wanted to leave no stone unturned. So when you would go to a Dodger game, to cover a Dodger game, 3.5, 4 hours before the game, there's Mookie at shortstop with Dino Ebel, the other coaches on that team, and he's taking ground ball after ground ball after ground ball. And Miggy Rojas right next to him, basically counseling him. And they talk about the bounces and what should you do in this and what should you do in that. And I thought during the year when he was struggling, I thought, man, he was sick at the beginning of the year. He was like 165 pounds, and maybe he wore himself down. So, Mo, I agree with you, because now that he has this part settled, hey, I can be an elite shortstop. That's going to give him peace of mind. And I think next year he will take off offensively. And, I know there are people in the Dodgers organization early in the year who are wondering, is this the right thing? It's part of what makes someone like him great, is that he has to drive himself that way, in that way, and push himself that way and challenge himself that way. And that's why he's going to, he'll wind up making a speech in Cooperstown someday.
Correct.
It could be a little prisoner of the moment, Buster, but I thought just overall the season was incredible. I think coming off of this year with the World Series we had a home run chase, Shohei doing all-time performances in the postseason. You got a little bit of time to decompress. How did this season feel, I guess, meaningful as far as maybe the next chapter of baseball, the buzz of the sport? Because I see even the viewership numbers, and I'll watch it no matter what, but it seemed like people were really into this season. It captivated a lot of people. Did you feel that?
Brendan, no doubt about it. And at the end of it, you don't want to be a prisoner of the moment, but you also don't want to dismiss what you just saw. And so, I'm having conversations with people like Peter Gammons and saying, okay, 1975 World Series was epic. The end of the 2011 World Series, David Freese, the game-tying triple and then the home run, that was absolutely epic. 1991 for sure. I think Game 7 was the greatest game that I've ever seen, with all the twists and turns. And the World Series itself, in my lifetime, was the best World Series that I've ever seen. You just loved the fact that, you had these great games and the star power, Ohtani, the greatest player that we've ever seen. But also, Vladimir Guerrero Jr., who for me I always knew he was obviously a great hitter, but when you're talking to other Blue Jay players, they talked about how in those last 8 weeks of the year, weeks of the regular season and in the postseason, he emerged as a leader. It was really cool. I walked up to him before Game 7 and I said, hey, Vladdy, I'm going to tell you, I'm jealous of you, because my last class at Vanderbilt, I got a D+ in Spanish. Right. And I said, you're out here doing, interviews in your second language. How impressive is that? The defense. And Mo, I'm curious your take on this. That play he made at first base in Game 7 was one of the best I've ever seen for a first baseman, because he was so decisive. He was so precise. The idea that you're a foot and a half away from the first base, but you're throwing to second to facilitate the throw back to double play, that was remarkable. And his base running was remarkable. But you have Vladimir Guerrero Jr. and Betts and Freeman. It was phenomenal.
It was great. Those type of plays, and you love it because of the size, like the Andres Galarraga, the big cat. That's how he was moving. You could see in his eyes. He was intent on trying to bring a World Series home. And that's really why I was pulling for him. But yeah, what a great series with so many different things. And I thought Toronto was going to be on the mat after Game 3, 18 innings. I just didn't think they were going to be able to get up. And for them to get up and keep going, I thought it was tremendous. On that note, check this out. How do you see now the free agent market shaping up after the World Series? You got a Bo Bichette conversation now. What is Toronto going to do to try to keep that whole thing together? Yankees, Red Sox, all these, Phillies with the different things, situations that they have going on. The Northeast market, how tough that is. What they got to do to keep that going. How do you see the free agent market shaping up coming up in 2026?
So as you guys know, because you've got the labor situation, you got the current labor deal expires at the end of December or beginning of December next year. There's a lot of speculation that maybe that impending labor stoppage could wind up impacting this winter's market. I don't think that's going to happen except for one thing. I think that players who may otherwise, who will be under team control beyond next year, who you would talk about in possible trades next summer, teams will move them this winter. Because if you hold on to those guys next summer till next July, Joe Ryan, for example, Stephen Kwan of the Guardians, then no one's going to give you real value for them because they don't know about the beginning of the 27 season.
Correct.
But besides that, guys, I think there's going to be a lot of spending this winter. Toronto established itself, and we really should have thought of them as being this big market team because they have the whole country.
Right.
The Red Sox have New England. They've got Boston. The Blue Jays have 40 million people in Canada, a third of whom were watching that World Series game. So yes, as we get started talking with agents, they think that the Blue Jays are going to be very aggressive, which is, you would assume that there's going to be conversation with Bo Bichette. We'll see how he feels about maybe changing positions. A lot of people don't view him as a shortstop anymore. And Mo, you know that there are a lot of players who just would prefer not to play in Canada. That's just a reality. And we'll see, how that affects some of the choices. But I think they're going to be one of the most aggressive teams. The Dodgers will be aggressive for sure. They've got a lot of money coming off their books, the likes of Clayton Kershaw and moving on. The Yankees, the big question is whether or not they're going to keep Cody Bellinger. He was a great fit in the way that that he played this year and the positional flexibility that he gave Aaron Boone every day. And he told him on the day they acquired him, I don't care if you play me left, center, right, first base, whatever. And you don't have to tell me ahead of time. I'll show up the ballpark, I'll look at the lineup, and I'll do what you want. That is a rare commodity. And we saw this with the Devers situation. Rare commodity for a team to have. So they have to find that one outfielder. The Phillies, people around the sport expect that they will invest big in Kyle Schwarber, who's not only a great hitter, but if I were to drop a list of the top 10 teammates that I've seen, CC Sabathia would be on there. Kyle Schwarber, those two guys would be fighting for number 1 and number 2 on that list. So the Phillies really value him and they want to bring him back.
You talked about, the labor issue. Like, how do you feel like if that does happen, how detrimental do you think it would be to the sport? Most talked about the 94 strike before. As we said, the sport feels as hot as it's been in a while. How critical do you think it would be to avoid that? Or do you feel it's inevitable we're facing that?
I think it absolutely would be devastating. The sport is in a great place, especially internationally, marketing. I mean, the Dodgers, impact in Japan and that fan base there, the fan base in South Korea. Personally, and I'm just a dopey sports writer. I think it'd be nuts for the people involved to let this happen. And I would say, I think that on the ownership side, just having talked to both sides quite a bit, I would say you better not threaten this gravy train for the sake of trying to get a salary cap. And I also would say on the flip side, I would say to the union leadership, you better prepare for the possibility of a salary cap because, and study the information and be able to explain to players, because the argument that MLB is going to make to players is if you get 47% of the pie now, as if we get a salary cap cost certainty, we might get 50%. You better be able to explain to the rank and file why that's a bad idea.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
And it reminds me, Mo, actually of this issue reminds me of the PED issue back in the 90s, where you had, the union leadership saying no testing, never any testing, never going to agree to testing. And when you talk to rank and file players, they whisper, yeah, we need testing. and so what happened is, and Mo, this, back in 2002, when that labor talk was going down, players basically pulled aside Gene Orza, Don Fehr, and said, hey, guys, we need to do something here. Right. And it ran counter. And I kind of wonder if that's what's going to happen with the salary cap issue, where you're going to have rank and file players who make up the majority of the union going to leadership saying, we need to at least have this conversation to compensate younger players more money than they're getting now.
On that PED issue, Buster, we have this new ballot coming out. Bonds, Clemens, Sheffield, and others. What's your thoughts on that? I know my thoughts, and I'll say them. These guys are great players. I think they should be in the Hall of Fame if you want to define it any way. But these are some of the best people, best guys in the game that I was, everybody, I get so frustrated. Everybody knocks the 90s like everybody was doing steroids in the 90s. They weren't. There was guys that, things happened, but we had a lot of great players in that era. So what do you think about, the new Hall of Fame ballot coming out with these guys that I mentioned on it?
So I stopped voting for the Hall of Fame on the player, obviously on the writers ballot, about 8 years ago, because I thought the rules were clearly stacked against the likes, aimed to be stacked against, Bonds and Clements, reducing the number of years of eligibility. And it infuriated me. And I actually had a talk with Kenny Lofton about this at the World Series. I said, Kenny, you were one of the guys who were hurt by these stupid rules where they limit the ballot to 10 people. Like a voter can, I said, because the last ballot I did, I left Curt Schilling off the Hall of Fame. I think he absolutely is a Hall of Famer. Mike Bassina off the ballot. I thought he was a Hall of Famer. Jeff Kent, because a lot of the PED, guys who were linked to it were not cycling off the ballot. So every year I'd start out with the best player. I'd put Bonds. I'd put Clemens. And I would vote for those guys, but it was clear and still is clear that there are a lot of writers who won't vote for them. My feeling is, you remember this letter that Joe Morgan put out about, I think, 8 years ago, where it was a letter to the writers saying, the Hall of Fame is a sacred place. With all due respect to Joe Morgan, it's a baseball museum. And I think the best baseball players should be in the Hall of Fame. And stuff happens. The thing that kind of, bothers me about Roger and Barry is they have taken a lot of scrutiny more than anybody else, because guess what? They were the best players. They weren't alone in fostering this situation. Owners fostered the situation with their handling of it. The union leadership fostered the handling of it. The media, we did a terrible job covering it back then. And the collective response from the industry led to the situation where players were making these choices. And look, I don't think you feel sorry for individual players, but the idea that you're going to use the character clause to keep out a Barry Bonds is ridiculous. There are already guys in the Hall of Fame who use steroids. And I don't understand why we have to go through this every year as opposed to a simple standard, put the best players in the Hall of Fame.
Right.
Well, it's also an interesting thing. Like, Buster, how, as a reporter for so long, did you keep feelings out of it? I'm sure there wasn't always great moods in clubhouse and whatnot, but some of them feel like, oh, maybe I wasn't the best towards the media, and there were gripes held. Like, how did you balance that with dealing with players from a day-to-day basis all the years that you've been doing it?
So, and I got, I've been fortunate to cover a lot of Hall of Famers. The first star that I ever covered was Tony Gwynn, who is a gift to a young writer. When he passed away, it felt personal, right? Because he just meant so much to my career to be able to cover him. And then I covered Cal Ripken when he was the Iron Man, 95, 96. I got to tell you, it wasn't easy. And I didn't really have that to this day. I think it's polite, but I wouldn't ever say it. I had a great relationship with him. I actually didn't have a hard time separating myself when it came to the ballot. I covered Eddie Murray for a year in 1996. And as you guys know, he had not a good relationship with reporters. But when his name came on the ballot, and he was always nice to me, by the way. But when his name came on the ballot, I'm like, it's not a question of whether or not you liked him or not like him. Look at what's on the back of the baseball card. My God, 29 writers, I think that's the number, did not vote for Rickey Henderson for the Hall of Fame. That is mind-boggling to me. He's the greatest leadoff. He's one of the greatest players ever. And I asked one of the voters at one point, hey, how come you didn't vote for Rickey? He goes, well, I went into the clubhouse one day and, he turned his back. And I'm like, wow, It's not about you, dude. It's not about you. It's about their careers and what they've earned. You know, whether it is Cal, of course I voted for Cal. Of course I voted for guys that maybe I didn't have the warmest relationship with, because that was my job. It's about the players.
I got one more question. I got a couple more questions, but this one I want. This one I need to know. Who did you vote for 1995 AL MVP? Who was your vote?
I love to have this conversation, okay? Because, of course, as you know, each person's vote, individual writer's vote that year was decisive. Right. If Albert Bell was 1 or you were 2 or you 1 or Albert Bell 2, that was decisive. I voted for you 1 and I voted for Albert Bell 2, and I have kicked that around in my head for 30 years, okay? Because my logic, and I wrote this at the time, was, I mean, that Cleveland team was ridiculously stacked. They were loaded.
And I lost Jose for half the season.
Right. And that was my logic at that time. And it's interesting because I think, as you know, how writers look at the ballots changes over time. And now it's much more analytically driven. And it comes down to a pure question of who has the best stats. That's how the voting is done now. And Albert, 50 doubles, 50 home runs. Good Lord.
Yeah, awesome.
And so I'm curious about your view on it, because you meant, the way I judged it was, you meant more to the Red Sox that year than Albert did to Cleveland, because Cleveland was stacked and you guys weren't.
I looked at it. I looked at it like I was without Jose for half the season, and my stat that I always thought was the most important was RBIs, and we tied in that year. We both drove in 126 or whatever it was that year. So that's how I looked at it. And regardless, I got the trophy in my house. So, we're good.
No takes backs.
I mean, does my logic? I'm always curious about how you viewed that. From your perspective.
The same way you did, Buster. I'm with you. Thank you very much.
Do you feel like voter fatigue can be a real thing with awards? Because yes. I mean, I don't know if Shohei Ohtani you'll ever get sick of somebody like that, but an idea that, hey, there's another great story here, even if somebody's been good. Is that a real thing, Buster?
I do think it is a real thing. And all we have to do is look at the NBA voting. There was a year in the 90s in which Michael Jordan wasn't the MVP. Are you kidding me? I think Karl Malone won it one year. Yeah. And that year, if you had a draft of the whatever number of teams they had, 25 coaches at that time, 25 out of 25 would have taken Jordan. Yeah, I mean that. And I think it to some degree. I'm curious about how the voting winds up landing in the American League MVP voting, because Cal Raleigh's had this phenomenal year. We've never seen a catcher put up the production that he did. I had one agent say to me that for each win above replacement, 1 WAR, he would give a catcher 1.45 WAR, because the position just has different demands. But I also think the voter fatigue, I'm curious to see if that has an impact on Aaron Judge, who's one of the best hitters we've ever seen, but he's a Yankee and he's been around a while and voters have put his name on the ballot before. And Cal Raleigh's sort of he's the flavor of 2025.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of like, as a fan, I can't hate that, because it's one of these things, it's nothing against Aaron Judge, but it was cool to see what Cal Raleigh did this year. And so, that happened. You mentioned NBA. I remember that happened with Russell Westbrook. He was the first one to get a triple-double in a while, and then everybody has this. It's like, yeah, but that was awesome when it happened. I don't think there's anything wrong with celebrating a season. And then, you can maybe go back and say, was that the way to go? I do think there's something special about Raleigh doing what he did this year, and I don't think it takes away from the greatness of Judge.
And I'm a Judge fan. I think the man is a great man. If there's 1 or 2 Yankees who I really respect, and he's one of them. But I just think that Cal Raleigh, at that position behind the plate, calling the game every day, and the Gold Glove. And then I saw the guy run the bases. I was like, this guy does everything. And 60 home runs. And also, it's usually switch hitters. There's a drop-off in either power or average on the offside. And I don't know which one is his offside. But he, on average, hit just as many home runs on the left as he did on the right. And I think that for that alone, I just think behind the plate, calling the game, catching, in and out. These guys are throwing to him, setting up, blocking, all of that. I just think he's the MVP. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, and it's interesting when the Player Association announced its player awards, Cal Raleigh was the MVP. And I think that, it's worth remembering that because when we've had this discussion among the nerds like myself, I think it's important for them to hear that from players who understand maybe better than we do what the toll of that is. And Mo, just an aside on Cal Raleigh, you'll appreciate this. His dad's family bought about 500 acres of farmland in northern Vermont. That's his roots, okay? And he grew up on Vermont maple syrup. I talked to his dad. Cal grew up on Vermont maple syrup. And there was an old manager of the Cincinnati Reds named Dave Bristol, who whenever their family friend, whenever he calls and talks to him, he always refers to him as Bacon.
How is it, I guess, not today, but you've obviously been in the game forever. So like today's player, is there a little bit of like, oh man, I get to talk to Buster Olney these days to build those relationships? Or do you still go about it like you did when you were a young reporter?
You would hope that you can go about it. I always try to, when you talk to people, before I talked to you guys today, I knew Mo, and Peter, how much regard he has for you. So I made a point I wanted to talk to him. So you connect with people that way. If I go to Cal Raleigh and I knew that he had these Vermont roots and I'm like, I grew up an hour from, you do that whenever you go into a clubhouse, whenever you talk to a player, you try to find the common denominator. Kevin Gossman, with his background, I remember, talking about someone that he knew when he was back at LSU. I still love to do that. You do definitely get some double takes from players because they've seen you on television. But as I tell my kids, it's not really about me. It's about the person who has my job at ESPN. Because ESPN is so ubiquitous, but it's fun to go in. I always feel like it's a privilege and always have been a privilege for me to talk to people who are so good at their craft, like a Tony Gwynn, like Mariano Rivera, Trevor Hoffman. I covered two of the greatest closers of all time. And I feel really fortunate. And I try to tell those stories like relief pitchers love to hear the Mariano Rivera stories, and I have a lot of them.
Well, what's your favorite one? Do you have a favorite Mariano story?
So Mo Rivera, Mo is Mo. You know this. He would always keep the same face on the mound. Okay, he would never change his demeanor that much, but behind that, he was a raging competitor. Okay. In 2001, I decided that year because he had that great cut fastball. He broke bats. Troy O'Leary told me how he kept his real gamers away from Mariano Rivera's cutter because he knew how much at risk they would be. I decided that year to keep track of how many bats he broke. And every couple weeks, Mariano Rivera would go, "How many have I got? How many have you counted?" And I'd be like, "I've got 20. I counted you at 28." Because I go to the bat boy, Luigi, and I go to Jorge Posada after every game. I'd go, "I counted 2 today. I heard 2." And they're like, no, it was actually 1 or no, it was 3. But Mo, that whole year, he would go, "You're shorting me. I know you're shorting me." Like, he just loved the idea of keeping track of that stat. The other one was 141 innings in the postseason for Mariano Rivera. He allowed 2 home runs. Okay. Right. One was to Jay Payton in the 2000 World Series. The first one was to Sandy Alomar. And I watched him answer the questions about that. And as always, he was polite. He'd say, "No, it didn't bother me. I'm fine. This is 98. I'm fine. I'm ready to move ahead." And I watched him answer that all year. And I said, "Mo, I'm listening to you. And it really doesn't, I get the sense it really doesn't bother you." And he looked at me and it was like the veil of being polite went down. He said, "No, you know why? That Sandy Alomar Jr. home run, I made that." And I was like, it took me aback. And I was like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "Right-handed hitter, 96 miles per hour, which used to be a thing, sticks his bat out and the ball barely goes over the right field wall. I made that home run." And I was like, wow, that is some mental ninja right there.
Exactly. Bus, I got one more for you. And I think this is an important one. the influx right now of managers who do not have a lot of experience at the MLB level, where is this coming from? What is the thought? What is the process of why this is heading in this direction? And how do you think, I always wonder with a young manager, what is the most important thing he needs to do to be able to connect with his players? So you got two things there I'm asking you. The influx of inexperience, and once you get there, what's the main thing that a manager without that experience needs to do to get his clubhouse going in the right direction?
Okay, from 50,000 feet, to answer your question, it's about control from the front office. And I'm not presenting that as a pejorative or negative or positive. I'm just saying it's about control. The front office wants a manager who will implement decisions based on the information they're giving them. You are not getting a job with one of these modern day front offices if they feel like you're going to be all rogue and run off and do your own thing. So you start out with that. Number two is the understanding and the implementation of that information. I've had people come up to me, guys I covered as former players, and say, hey, have you heard about a job opening? What should I do? And I say to each one of them, you have to be fluent in this language that front offices are speaking. Back in, the idea 15 years ago that a pitcher would want to know his spin rate on every pitch and have a camera which tells him exactly how the ball leaves his fingertips. That's not something anyone would have expected, but it's what's valued right now. And so the manager has to be well versed in that. And we actually have seen with the choices of pitching coaches already the last 5 or 6 years, guys who, they worked at Driveline. Maybe they were a successful college coach. They've come in and taken the jobs. Well, now we're starting to see it with managers. And personally, this is my opinion. For me, one of the number one questions about a manager, and it would be the first thing that I'd wonder about, what's your sense of whether or not the players will play hard for him? Dusty Baker would get all kinds of criticism during his time as manager for pitching decisions and that sort of thing. All I know is every time I watch one of Dusty's teams, they played hard. And the players thought that Dusty cared about them individually. Right. And I have myriad stories about that, about him connecting. I think Dave Roberts now, in initial couple of years when he was the manager of the Dodgers, it was very much where he's trying to work within the analytics system that the Dodgers had at that time. And over time, Dave has learned to stick his elbows out a little bit and to step up and make decisions in a moment, which may not necessarily be what's in the book. For example, starting Miguel Rojas in Game 6, right? They're down in the series. I asked Dave Roberts before Game 6, I said, what's that change? He goes, you know what? We got to have this game. I got to have my guy Miggy Rowe in there. And he makes 4 great plays defensively, and the next night he hits the game-tying home run. And Dusty had such a great feel for players. I think Dave has a great feel for players. There has to be a mix of that. It can't just be, well, the notebook says this. I think that's a recipe for failure.
I agree with you 100%. And I'm not in those rooms, but I know that the manager needs to have some type of feel of what's going on to make a decision when what's needed, whether it's, hey, man, he needs to go another inning, or, hey, man, he needs to come out. You got to be able to see it, in my opinion, along with some data, but you got to be able to see it to make the right choice. And Dave Roberts, he proved it, in the World Series this year.
Can I give you another example along those lines? Mm-hmm. So it was, and I can't remember the exact year, it was the year Trey Mancini was traded to the Houston Astros from the Baltimore Orioles. And he, had a tough time and he wasn't playing well. And he wasn't even in the lineup on a daily basis, but they're getting ready to play the playoffs against the Yankees. And Trey shows up at the clubhouse, and Dusty Baker, and again, this is a player he's only known for like 6 weeks, 2 months, trade deadline. After they got him at the trade deadline. And he walked up to him and said, hey, I was in St. Patrick's Cathedral today, and knowing that Trey Mancini is also Catholic, he said, I brought these beads for you. I'm thinking of you. Right. And Trey Mancini, what that meant to him in that moment, like that Dusty would be thinking of him at that time when he's at the fringe of the roster. And lo and behold, in the next couple days, Trey comes up in a big spot, gets the job done. I thought, that's an important part of being a leader of players, is my observation. And that's why I do hope that going forward, as they implement these young guys, that also remains in the recipe.
Correct. Buster, what coverage you got for the off season? Your podcast articles coming up on winter. What do you got for the listeners?
So yeah, we do the Baseball Tonight podcast 2 or 3 times a week. During the regular season, it's 3 times a week, and then during the off season, it's a couple times a week. Working on that, and working on all the moves. As you guys know, the GM meetings are going on right now, right. And so there's a lot of preparation for the big moves for the wintertime. And I'm working on a piece on Vladimir Guerrero Jr. and his leadership, which I was so impressed by how he emerged during the postseason.
Just had the eyes, man. You could see it.
Yes.
You could see it in the eyes. When you're watching, you could see it. This guy is ready to play. One more quick one. You got a breakup now between MLB and ESPN. How you gonna roll inside and outside of that?
Well, I think in this case they separated. If we're gonna have the breakup, they separated. Now they're back together again.
Good.
They announced. I actually don't think the deal's been formally announced, but Rob Manfred came on ESPN Radio during the World Series and confirmed what we knew on the inside, that they'd been working on a different package. It's not the Sunday night package, which I've done the last 15 years, but it's another package of games on a different day of the week. They just haven't made the formal announcement yet.
Good. That's how it should be.
Buster, this is a thrill, man. It was great speaking with you. I've loved your work for a long time, and we appreciate you joining us on the Mo Vaughn podcast, powered by Perfect Game and the Vaughn Sports Academy. This was a thrill.
Thanks, man. Brother, thanks for coming on, man. This was great. I enjoyed it. I could talk to you for days. Make sure you tell Peter Gammons I said hello and everybody else out there, and keep it going. Thanks for coming down.
Absolutely. And thanks for having me. Super fun. As you said, we got a million stories and it's always fun to share some of them.